I think one definition of foraging is just searching for provisions. So of course that covers food.
Foraging is a natural instinct. There's a huge cultural history to foraging. In the past, that and hunting was the only way we could obtain our food.
It's one of the only things left to us that doesn't have rules and regulations. You can't go to university and do a degree in foraging. You can't be a foragologist or study foragology. I think a lot of young people are sometimes now frightened to do anything without a certificate or a course, or, worried that they're going to contravene some unwritten rule or law.
I think people stopped foraging because of the increased availability of food and variety of food. I think people were actually really fed up after the war when foraging became really an essential part of life.
I think it's a sign of how detached we are from nature, that people don't realise there's loads of food out there that they can just walk about and pick up for themselves. Unless it's clinically wrapped in cellophane in the supermarket, they think it's poisoned or inedible or dangerous or something. British people, hardly any of them will eat wild mushrooms. For millennia, our ancestors ate wild mushrooms, but somehow now we think they're all poisonous. But I do find it really odd that we're so averse to wild collected food these days.
Mushroom hunting is the one that people worry about most. I'm not sure that's quite right. Some really nasty plants out there. The commonest plant I saw this year was foxglove. 2 leaves of that, you're dead. So you really do have to be super careful.
But in general, people are terrified of mushrooms. There's about 12 really toxic mushrooms that you need to learn. But, a lot of it's just about learning.
Do 3 this year, 3 next year, get good. So you do 5 the year after that. And there you've got 10, 11, got to the maths. So there's a few places where you really wouldn't want to pick anything. The doggy event horizon, which are 2, they're over by the vertical horizons, which is how far up they can wee. And the other one is how far they are taken for their walk. You just have to be careful. It's a matter of common sense. Roadsides aren't too bad, but you have to choose your roadside and even choose the side of the road you forage on. I would never forage anywhere near a roundabout because their vehicles just sit there, and that's very highly polluted area, so I'd never do that.
If you collect food from hedgerows, it probably will be contaminated slightly with pesticides that have been sprayed in the field if they're hedgerows next to arable fields, but nowhere near as much as the crop itself, which of course is what ends up on the supermarket shelves.
But there are some basic sensible do's and don'ts around actually foraging. The most important one being, don't ever put anything in your mouth unless you are 100% sure you know what it is. If you can tell the difference between an iceberg lettuce and a Savoy cabbage, you actually have the mental power to go foraging. But if you read about both of them in a book, having never seen them before, and tried to ID them from just their description, it would be very difficult.
I love foraging. Blackberries mainly, actually, for jam, but I do go for mushrooms in the autumn and sometimes sweet chestnuts. The same thing motivates me as growing my own food in the garden. It's just I love free food. Why don't people harvest food that grows wild more? I don't really understand that.
When it comes to the health properties of plants, we don't even know what we're missing out of our diet. Because, if you think a plant has on average, well, let's say it only had 100 different phytochemical compounds, just so we can do the maths more easily. People used to eat between 300 and 400 species across the course of a year, perhaps. That's 30,000 different types of phytochemicals. Whereas nowadays, 50% of the entire world's daily calorie intake comes from just 3 vegetables: wheat, corn, and rice. Part of the problem with modern diets and a lot of the food intolerances and food insensitivities is that people persist on eating foods out of season. Wheat is harvested at the end of the summer and saved up, and then would have been finished at the end of the winter. But you would then have had, 6 or 7 months without any wheat until it came back into season. But if you have, a wheat cereal for breakfast every day, and then you have a sandwich for lunch, and then you have pasta for supper every evening, And you do that 365 days of the year. And after 20 odd years, you tell me you're gluten intolerant. I mean, it makes sense, right?
And we know, for example, that a huge proportion of the food we buy, lots of bread and cakes and cereals and cookies and things, are contaminated with pesticides. Particularly, glyphosate is very commonly found in human food because we spray it onto crops just as they're ripening to kill them off before harvest. So we're spraying the food just before we process it to eat with toxins. We've ended up with a industrial farming system which is basically more or less excludes all forms of life apart from the crop. And I don't think that's sustainable. I think we need to find ways of farming that basically work with nature rather than trying to kill everything, so that they encourage pollinators and they encourage natural enemies of the crop pests to control them naturally rather than using pesticides. Currently, we actually grow about 3 times as many calories as we need to feed the global human population, but then we waste about 1/3 of all the food that's grown. But overall, it's a really, really inefficient way of feeding the world. And if you look at, say, organic farming, which uses no fertilizers and no pesticides essentially, or only naturally occurring ones, on average it produces between 80 and 90% of the yield of conventional industrial farming. So actually, if we just reduced food waste, we could easily feed the whole world from organic farming and wouldn't need any pesticides at all. And we could do it in a way that's actually sustainable, that doesn't destroy the soils that future generations are going to need to grow their crops in, and doesn't wipe out the pollinators that they're going to need to pollinate their crops.
Yeah, it's a problem of scale. 66 million people in this country, they're not going to be able to live off of foraged foods. There's certain things which really you can go completely mad. A lot of the things we forage are effectively weeds. So sea nettles, dandelions. It's really impossible to overpick those things. Just pick what you need, not necessarily what you want. It's stuff in the store cupboard.
I do a lot of pressure canning in these things. So I make as a venison stew or other soups. They will last for years in those jars out of a fridge. Of course, making lots of drinks, whether they be fermented drinks or wines and stuff, is a way of preserving. Within the realms of foraging, you immediately learn some tangible lessons about sustainability.
If you go by what the newspapers say, things like that, foraging is Eastern European strip forest bare, arrests in Epping Forest as people hoover up mushrooms. There's this sense that foraging is damaging to the environment. But foraging itself isn't damaging to the environment, because if you're really into foraging, you want your food source to be there year after year after year. So all the foragers I know are actually eco-stewards, and they're the ones whose heart breaks the most when they go back to find it's been ploughed up for a housing estate or, water meadow dug over to put in a turbine, or, it's human development, it's the concretization of the globe that causes habitat destruction.
You can't say there's laws against foraging, there's laws that delimit what you can do. That's now enshrined in the 1968 Theft Act, which says he who picks fruit, flowers, fungi or foliage from any land, provided it is growing wild and is for personal use, does not steal what he picks. If you start to find people complaining about you foraging, stand up for your rights. The rights are easily lost, and it is absolutely tragic if it happens.
I think we've lost our sort of connection with nature because we've become an increasingly kind of urban species. It really worries me that people don't really understand that we're part of nature, and they don't understand where food comes from.
And if children are never left to spend time in nature, they're not going to form that relationship, and they're going to grow up divorced from nature. Going out foraging, it's good for you. It relieves stress, it cheers you up, it takes your mind off the worries. Plus you get to walk, so walking's good for you, you get some exercise, you get to nibble on lots of greens, which are the bitter flavours which stimulate your gut. And that's just such a release from this world where you're constantly on duty with your phone and your social media, and it's ping, 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 wanting your attention all the time. Yes, nature wants your attention as well, but it's much more subtle. You know, it's in the call of a bird or the rustle of a leaf. It's calming to the soul. I've long ago stopped trying to think that my courses are about teaching you really how to identify this and what to do with it and all the rest of it. What I want to do is to tell the story of the natural world around them in such a way that they are hooked, entranced, addicted.
What I really noticed is that the transformation from initial reluctance and boredom to increasing engagement and interest throughout the day. Yeah, people can really go on a journey and be transformed just in a few hours, really, working with wild food and just being outside in nature.
I overheard one lady talk to another, and she said, you know, a walk's never going to be the same again. People change their whole view of the natural world. Suddenly it becomes much more interesting. Up until then, it was sort of pretty fuzzy green, you know, of stuff which, you know, okay, well, I know that's an oak tree. They know that's some sort of grass, and that's some sort of toadstool, but actually getting much closer, and they haven't got close before. That makes it interesting, and they can see it's beautiful and fascinating, and people come to love it. And if you love something, you protect it. That's what I do more than anything.